Our final witness that I have the pleasure of introducing is Dr. David Muhlhausen, Research Fellow in Empirical Policy Analysis at the Heritage Foundation here in town. Dr. Muhlhausen joined Heritage in 1999 after serving on the staff for the Senate Judiciary Committee. He holds a doctorate in public policy from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and a bachelor's degree in political science and justice studies from Frostburg State University. Dr. Muhlhausen is also an adjunct professor at George Mason University. Welcome, sir. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. My name is David Muhlhausen. I'm a research fellow in empirical policy analysis in the Center for Data Analysis at the Heritage Foundation. I thank Chairman Joe Walsh, Ranking Member Kirk Schrader, and the rest of the committee for the opportunity to testify today on the Disaster Loan Fairness Act. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. After the President declares a major disaster, the Disaster Loan Fairness Act would set the interest rates for the Small Business Administration's Disaster Loan Program at 1% for eligible applicants. Unfortunately, as my testimony will illustrate, the Disaster Loan Fairness Act does not provide the necessary reform to our nation's disaster prevention and recovery programs. My testimony focused on 3 deficiencies of the legislation. First, by providing more generous benefits, the legislation does nothing to reduce the over-reliance of state and local governments on the federal government for the provision of recovery assistance. Far too frequently, the federal government has been the primary source of recovery efforts for natural disasters that are inherently localized in small geographic areas and do not rise to the level that should require action by the federal government. Increasingly, Americans are becoming overly dependent on federal assistance after natural disasters occur. Further, disaster assistance appears to have become a political tool because the number of disaster declarations is significantly higher in election years compared to non-election years. Since 1996, the year President Clinton sought re-election, the number of disaster declarations issued by FEMA dramatically increased. The chart in my written testimony demonstrates this trend. The previous record of the most declarations in a year was set by President Clinton in 1996 with 158 incidences. President Obama smashed this record with 242 declarations in 2011. Given that 2012 is a presidential election year, I doubt this record is going to last very long. Essentially, this trend is the result of disaster responses that were once entirely local in nature and handled by state and local governments becoming nationalized, and thus the responsibility of the federal government. Second, with out-of-control spending surging and public debt threatening our nation's stability, the Disaster Loan Fairness Act increases federal spending. Instead of practicing fiscal constraint, the legislation does not reduce the cost of future disaster recoveries. Reform should be focused on preventative measures that limit the cost of disasters. Contrarily, this legislation puts the federal taxpayer on the hook for more spending. Third, increasing the generosity of SBA disaster loans creates a moral hazard by providing greater encouragement for homeowners, renters, and businesses to avoid purchasing adequate disaster insurance because natural disasters are low probability events. Clearly, having adequate insurance before disasters occur is the responsible course of action. While SBA disaster loans are intended to help applicants return their property to the same condition as before the disaster, the unintended consequence of this requirement is that applicants are forced to rebuild in the same disaster-prone location. For example, instead of relocating out of a town sitting in a major flood zone, applicants are required to rebuild in the same exact location. Thus, applicants are still located in a high-risk area, preventing a long-term solution from taking place. While this dilemma exists with or without the passage of the Disaster Loan Fairness Act, the legislation only increases the incentive to rebuild in high-risk areas. In conclusion, the Disaster Loan Fairness Act is neither fair to the federal taxpayer nor an effective reform of our nation's disaster prevention and recovery policies. Instead of considering this legislation, Congress should focus on reforms that make America more resilient to disasters and reduce recovery costs imposed on the federal taxpayer. That's all. Thank you.